My name is Kevin Ward. I'm the program director of the Sports Animal Radio Network and ESPN Radio in Tulsa. I'm also a deacon at the Park Church of Christ in Tulsa, in charge of all sports ministries. Thank you for listening to this episode of Suit Up. When you look at the life of Steve Largent, everything looks pretty good. In fact, it looks really good on paper. NFL Hall of Famer, past U.S. Congressman in Oklahoma who served multiple terms, successful businessman and TV pitchman, married father of 4. Then you start talking about real life, and one can see where Steve's relationship with the Lord has pulled him through some very tough times. My conversation with Steve Largent right after this.
This is Mitch Wilburn, preaching minister at the Park Church of Christ, proud sponsor of Suit Up. I'd like to extend an invitation to you to join us for worship at the Park. We're a Bible-based church that loves the Lord and loves people. We have one service on Sunday morning at 9 a.m., and that's followed by classes for everyone, from newborn to 100 years of age. The park sits on a rather large lot near the corner of Garnett and the Creek Turnpike, and offers a Sunday evening service at 6 p.m., and Wednesday night we meet at 7 p.m. Our youth have their own building with multiple men and women leading them, and our kids, age 1 to 5th grade, have their own educational wing that even has its own working carousel and ice cream parlor. And I love both. Kevin, the host of this podcast, is in charge of our sports ministry that goes on all year round with basketball, volleyball, softball, great activities. So come see us at the park on the corner of Garnett and the Creek Turnpike, or check us out on the web at parkplaza.org.
So, Steve, where I'd like to start is really go all the way back to 1954. And while a lot of people around here know that you were in Oklahoma City in your high school days, don't know when you moved to Oklahoma City because you were actually born in Tulsa.
That's right. I was born at St. John's Hospital in 1954 and lived here in Tulsa till I was 6 years old. And that's when my parents were divorced, and my mom, just for moral support and financial support as well from her dad, my grandfather, moved to Oklahoma City. And so I had, at that time, it was myself. I was the oldest child and had 2 younger brothers. And the 4 of us moved to Oklahoma City, and that's where I ended up going to high school, and then came back, of course, to the University of Tulsa.
We all know about football, and we'll get into a lot of that discussion as we go through this podcast, because you became one of the greatest football players to ever play, not only in the NFL, but also college, and we'll get to that here in a minute as well. But let's start with your love for football, and where did that actually start? How early of an age were you when you started playing?
I was 9 years old when I first played football, and of course, loved playing football. And I think really, as I think about it, my parents were divorced when I was 6, as I said, and I think some of that aggression or anger that was pent up in me found its full expression in playing football. And so I was a pretty darn good football player, whether we were playing in the backyard, which we did a lot, or playing, in Little League football.
Most of the time, Steve, when I'm talking with an athlete who has reached the kind of heights that you've reached, when you look back at their high school days or junior high days too, they excelled at more than just whatever sport, that took them to, in your case, the Hall of Fame. Were there other sports that you played at a younger age, and did you excel at those as well?
It's funny you should say that, because actually football was my second sport in terms of the love that I had for the game. The first was baseball, and I loved playing baseball. We played baseball all the time after school, and played on Little League teams and so forth. But that was really my first love. In fact, at Putnam City High School, where I graduated from, our senior year, we won the state championship. And Bob Shirley was named Player of the Year, and I was named All-State Catcher. And so it was really a high honor. And my intentions were to go to the University of Tulsa and play both football and baseball, as I had in college. And my freshman year, the coach that was there, he got fired, and the athletic director, who was F.A. Dry, named himself the athletic director and football head coach. And he called me into his office right after the football season was over, and I was preparing to start playing baseball. And he said, "Look, Steve," he said, "next spring we're going to have a real competition for the other wide receiver spot. And so if you want to compete for that position, you can. But if you want to play baseball, that's okay too." And so I kind of took that as a kind of a threat. And so I elected not to play baseball and played football. But really, baseball was my first love.
People who know anything about the University of Tulsa are like shocked that they once had baseball at TU. And I don't know if it was in the 70s when that sport was dropped or in the early 80s. Do you remember?
It was in the early 80s because they still had football when I played there. And not football, baseball when I played there. And they were a team that was always a threat to go to the College World Series. They had gone, I think, 2 years before I got to school there, and were always a threat to go back.
You kind of glossed over the fact that that battery at Putnam City was Steve Largent and Bob Shirley, and folks who will remember, Bob Shirley actually was a Major League Baseball pitcher for multiple teams for several years, and in fact, he resides in Tulsa now. I don't know if you guys ever get a chance to get together, but it sure would be fun to watch you guys have a catch.
Well, Bob has been a close friend of mine since we were probably 7 or 8 years old, maybe 9 years old. His family lived very close to my family, and so we were kind of buddies, playing baseball through little leagues together, oftentimes on the same team. And Bob was just a great guy and a great friend. And yes, I knew he was in Tulsa. And in fact, Bob Shirley, Steve Largent, and Alvin Adams have been named to the Putnam City Schools Hall of Fame, which they never had before. They just instituted this year. But we're going into their Hall of Fame the first year of his existence, and that'll be a fun time. That's the end of this month, August 30th.
Now, were you in the same class there at Putnam?
Same class.
So did you play basketball too then?
No, I didn't play basketball. That was beyond me. But I played baseball and football, okay. And Bob just played baseball.
And I guess that Alvin just played basketball.
Well, actually, Alvin would tell you he also played tennis.
Okay.
But I think that was just his senior year. He played tennis too. But Alvin was a great basketball player at Putnam City.
That's interesting. And of course, not too long after that, the school district would start breaking up until it became a 3-school district as it is now in Oklahoma City. So let me ask you this, Steve. Let's go back to your early years and talk about your faith. And when did you start really understanding about God, and what kind of prompted you to begin that relationship?
Well, it really happened when I was a sophomore in high school, and I would say it was due large part to the Young Life leader that led clubs for Putnam City High School. I started attending those and really enjoyed them, and his messages were always thought-provoking, and he developed a real strong personal relationship with me. His name was Scott Manley. And Scott became just a close friend and had been a close friend now for years until he passed away 4 or 5 years ago. And but he's the guy that really sort of turned the light on in my life. But I actually prayed to receive Christ at a revival that was held, and the guy just gave a great word picture. And I prayed to receive Christ that evening, and really my life hasn't been the same since then. It wasn't like it was a radical change in my life, because it wasn't. It was a slow, gradual, positive, continuous change of direction for me.
Steve, you talked about playing football and being able to get some aggression out. It's not well documented, but it certainly is documented that Your stepfather who came into your life was, at least I have read the word abusive, and you can certainly clear that up. But talk about maybe that also being a time in your life where you saw maybe there was a different direction that you wanted to take your life and the kind of father someday that you wanted to be.
Well, I was 9 years old when my mom remarried. My stepfather was a chronic alcoholic. In fact, he died an alcoholic, unfortunately. And he wreaked havoc in our house. He really was. He was a fairly passive alcoholic, drunk. But there were times when he would threaten and yell and scream and throw things, and he became a little more violent. He was not violent to my mom very often, and certainly wasn't violent to me at all. But he was difficult to live with, to say the least. And I just remember crying myself to sleep oftentimes, and thinking, man, when I get married and when I'm grown up and out of this house, I will never act like this. And I remember crying myself to sleep oftentimes saying that too.
Let's fast forward a little bit here. So you graduate from Putnam City High School, and the college offers aren't exactly rolling in one per day. Talk about the recruiting process and why you chose Tulsa.
Well, there were several schools that recruited me from Central State, which is what it was called at the time. It's all called Oklahoma.
University of Central Oklahoma.
University of Oklahoma,
mm-hmm.
Central Oklahoma right now. But they recruited me. Wichita State, TCU recruited me. Arkansas kind of gave me a look, but not for long. OSU recruited me, and then the University of Tulsa. And it was my grandfather who really sat me down and talked to me about the University of Tulsa and the advantages of going there and the education I would get there. And he really liked the school and had followed their sports for a long time as growing up in Tulsa before he moved to Oklahoma City. And the one thing that he said was, of all the schools I was looking at, Tulsa was the one that was throwing the ball the most. And as a receiver, that of course is what I wanted to see happen. And I really wasn't a guy that wanted to go to a school just because it was a famous school or a competitive school or whatever, and block for somebody else. I wanted to catch the ball.
Did you have aspirations of playing in the NFL at that time,
not
Steve?
at all. I never even gave it a second thought. I was trying to go to a school that I could play and get my education in 4 years and then go on and get a job. There wasn't anybody in my family that had ever been to college before, so I was going to be the first one. And actually, I didn't come out of high school with great grades either. In fact, I'll never forget, there was a counselor of mine who called me in for my annual visit, and she said, "Steve, I've looked at your grades, and in my opinion, you really don't. You're not a qualified college student. And you need to go to junior college or some kind of training school." And so that really fired me up. And so I just said in my heart, I know I can do this. I'm going to put out some effort and try to be a more accomplished college student than I was a high school student. And I think I effectively did that.
You obviously defined, because you didn't redefine a position in the NFL, you defined a position in the NFL. Was that position being crafted at Tulsa, this possession receiver, where the guy is not the fastest, he's not the biggest, he maybe doesn't have the best vertical? Were you able to hone that particular skill at TU?
Well, the skills that I was able to hone were really at the request of Jerry Rome, who was my college coach for 3 years, and then went on to become my professional coach for as long as he was in Seattle. he was the guy that really taught me a lot about the game and how to run routes and how to get open and all that kind of stuff. And so I really credit Jerry for my ability. But, the thing is that when you say, even when you said it just now and referred to me as a possession receiver, I had 819 catches in my career in the NFL, which at the time it was quickly eclipsed by some pretty great players. But at the time, I caught the most passes of anybody in the NFL, and my yards per catch as a possession receiver was 16. So I averaged 16 yards per catch. And now, if you catch 100 balls in the NFL, you're going to average about 6 or 7 yards per catch. Mm-hmm. That's just the way it is. But so I was a possession receiver, but I felt like I also used that to my advantage to get behind some defensive backs and hit some pretty big passes.
So let's go back to 1975 because you entered the NFL draft in 1976 after your career at Tulsa is over. Did you meet Terry at TU? How long did you guys date before you got married?
Terry and I started dating when we were juniors in high school. She was the cheerleader, and I was the football player, and we were just a natural couple. And it was really her parents that gave me some very positive guidance just by their behavior and the way they acted and the way they loved one another and loved their kids. And so it was not just my relationship with Terry that was impacted. It was my relationship or understanding of how a family operates. But I met Terry when we were freshmen in high school. So we were just 16 years old. We both had just turned, I turned 16 and she was about to turn 16 when we had our first date to a sock hop after a football game. So we've been married now for 44 years, going on 45 years in January, and she's still the love of my life.
Because a lot of husbands do this. I know I did with my wife. Now I was a little different because I was 30 before I got married, but it was very important for me to find a Christian woman or at least a believer that I wanted to start a family with. Was that something that you also saw in Terry and that was important to you? I don't know that I definitely that I had a particular any personal qualities that I had to qualify a woman. But I knew Terry loved the Lord, and I met her, saw her throughout the days of young life in high school. So I knew there was something different that I loved about her. But I'm not sure that I really had that checkoff list of things that I have to have in a wife. I just knew that I loved Terry and wanted to spend the rest of my life with her. It probably was just one of those things that came with the whole package, then that's what made you fall in love with her. But you were also, 21 when you got married?
I was 20 years old when we got married in the January of our junior year.
So had she followed you to Tulsa, or was she off somewhere else going to school?
No, she followed me to Tulsa, and of course she had great grades and always had great grades. But she came to Tulsa, and I'm glad she did.
All right, so let's move on to your getting ready for the draft. You end up going. This is 1976 in the fourth round to Houston. And then you got traded in the preseason to Seattle. You never even dressed out for Houston. Walk us through what happened with the Oilers and how that trade came about, and was that damaging in any way for you?
Yes. It was in Bum Phillips' second year as head coach of the Oilers, and he had a bunch of veteran players that had 8-9 years under their belt already, and there was no pre-training camp education for first-year players. So there was never an opportunity to go down there and start throwing balls with the quarterback or learning the routes or learning the defensive backs and how they played. None of that. I worked out with Howard Twilley up here in Tulsa. We ran sprints and we ran routes for one another and would throw the ball back and forth. And I got in great shape, but I went down to Houston really without a clue of what was expected of me or what I needed to know. And I think my coach, he was not used to coaching rookies either, and so it was just a bad fit for me. And after 4 weeks of training camp, actually 6 weeks of training camp, we had 2 weeks with no games, and then we had 4 weeks of games. But after those 6 weeks, I just knew that it wasn't looking good for me. And Bum Phillips called me into his office and said, "Steve, we're going to trade you now and give you a chance to play with somebody else." And all I heard him say is, "Steve, we're going to cut you now," just blah blah blah, because I was so focused on making that team and expected to make the team. I was the second draft pick, even though I was in the 4th round. They took Mike Barber in the 2nd round. They didn't have a 1st-round pick. They didn't have a 3rd-round pick, and then it was me in the 4th round. So I thought, well, for sure I could make this team, being the second drafted player of the whole team. And that, of course, did not turn out to be true. But they put me on the recallable waivers list, and San Francisco and Chicago both showed some interest, but Seattle was the one that said, "Hey, we'll give you an 8th-round draft choice." But that was because Jerry Rome was in Seattle jumping up and down, screaming at at his scouts and personnel people, saying, "We got to get this guy in Seattle, and if you don't get him, you're crazy." And he'd been doing the same thing before the draft, and of course they didn't listen to him. But they said, "Well, we'll spend an 8th-round draft choice and see if he can play in Seattle." And so they traded a 8th-round draft choice, and I went to Seattle. And I was really despondent when I went up there. I thought, I thought I could make the team. I didn't make the team. Now I'm going to Seattle, and I didn't even think about the fact that Jerry was there, or that he had installed our whole passing game in Seattle's offense. But when I went out there and got out in the first practice, Jim Zorn threw me a couple of balls, and I caught him. Actually, I dropped the first 2 passes he threw to me, and it gave a bad impression to Jim. But, Jerry pulled me aside and said, "Hey, listen, just do the stuff you did at Tulsa, and you'll make this team." And him saying that and kind of, just encouraging me, just is like a weight was lifted off my shoulders. And so then I just said, "I'm going to do what I did at Tulsa," and I did, and that was good enough to make the team. And so that really was a real breakthrough for me in my pursuit of playing in the NFL.
Well, let's see. 14 years later, you were a 7-time Pro Bowler, first team 3 different years, second team 4 different years, NFL Man of the Year just a year before you retired. At the time you retired, you were the leading pass catcher in the history of the game, number 1 in yardage, number 1 in receiving touchdowns. So obviously it worked out pretty well for you in Seattle. I got to ask, because you were raised in Oklahoma and then spent such a great deal of your life in Seattle, and now back. You've been in Oklahoma, been a politician here in the state, and also living now in Tulsa again. How do people in Seattle, what do they think of Steve Largent because of the Oklahoma City Thunder being probably in their eyes being stolen from the Seattle and moved to Oklahoma City, and you've got these great ties with both Seattle and Oklahoma?
Yeah, I don't talk about the Thunder when I'm in Seattle. I just don't. So that's a forbidden subject. But hopefully here in the next year or two they'll have their own team again. But that was very disappointing in Seattle to lose the Sonics. And no matter where they went, just to lose them was not good. So I don't try to associate myself with that decision at all.
I mentioned that you were in politics. You were a member of the House of Representatives, for 8 years here in Oklahoma, reelected 3 different times before you ran for governor and lost a very close race in 2002 to Brad Henry. You and Terry have 4 children, and I want to just bring this up for the listeners to this podcast who are also fathers. I know I've had some turmoil with children because none of us are perfect. And I know for me, it was going to the Lord and asking for guidance and wisdom to be able to help them. And you don't have to be specific about the incidents, Steve, but talk about when you had issues with your adult children and how your relationship with the Lord was able to help you and your family survive those.
Well, to be honest with you, the trials and tribulations began before our kids were out of our house, with Kramer being born, our 4th child, was born with spina bifida. And that was a devastating blow to all of us because, I was an athlete and I had 3 healthy kids and was getting ready to have my 4th, and I was excited about that. And then he was born, and the doctor said, "Hey, we got a problem here." And they whisked Kramer away and take him to Children's Hospital up in Seattle, and he has to have surgery the next day to close the hole in his spine. And they said it was going to be a lifelong medical concern with Kramer and his life and the spina bifida that he had. And so that was a real challenge to me and my wife. So we had to really exercise our faith at that time and just put the trust in the Lord and know that he's capable and willing to work all things for good. And so I would say now Kramer's 32 years old and he's married. His wife's a doctor, ironically, and on a fellowship right now in eastern Kentucky, and going to be back in Oklahoma before long. But it's really worked out well, and it was just one of the ways that the Lord showed us His power, His might, His sovereignty in Kramer's life. But we've had 4 kids, and they've all had issues, whether it was losing a job or whatever it might be. And you try to stand closely with them and help them any way you can. But sometimes you have to go through hard times. And I think my story is one of going through hard times, allowing those hard times to season your life, to make you a better person, to make you a bigger person. And I've seen how it's worked out for good in my life. And so, when my kids are going through hard things, I'll try to help them as much as I can, but also with the mindset and the vision of the Lord's working in their life, and there's no doubt that they'll be a better person if they can hang in there than they would be otherwise.
Steve, thank you so much for your time and for being a part of this podcast on Suit Up. And you and I have had an occasion to talk several times over the last few years with my tie-in with the Sports Animal, and you've always been very gracious to us on the Sports Network, and now gracious with me on this podcast. And I know this is going to be an inspirational story for a lot of people to hear, and I appreciate your honesty and your sharing.
Well, no problem, Kevin. Anytime.
My thanks to Steve Largent for being a part of this podcast. Please give us a 5-star rating, and don't forget to download more episodes of Suit Up on podbean.com at SuitUp611.